All right, I'm going to select share screen. Hopefully all will go well. All right. Everyone see this?
Yeah, it looks great.
All right, so I've titled my talk "The Scandal of Faculty Hiring," just to be provocative. Little bit by way of background. I'd like to begin with this quote: "Every day, the university wakes up and breaks the law." That's something that a University of Washington professor told me while I was reporting for a piece for the Free Press. When I asked him about his university's DEI hiring procedures. And at the time, I was very amused by this statement, but I also had not necessarily seen all that much evidence for this pretty commonly held belief among at least the people I was talking to. A lot of people I spoke with basically assured me, no, there really is something of a scandal in faculty hiring. The university hiring committees often have a disregard for things like civil rights law and have a disregard for things like the First Amendment and the imperative of academic freedom. I am a senior fellow at the National Association of Scholars. My job is to investigate higher education. The main source for today's talk that I'm going to use, it's going to be documents that I've acquired primarily through public records requests, and primarily since that day that my friend at the University of Washington told me that every day the university wakes up and breaks the law. And what I found is that there truly is a scandal in faculty hiring going on, and there are a lot of implications. But what I want to do first is kind of frame the discussion with some of the research and reporting I've done, specifically on medical education, because I think that this is a particularly pertinent example to help us think about how our institutions have undergone a kind of transformation. So the first example to bring up would be the UNC School of Medicine. In 2020, the UNC School of Medicine convened a task force to integrate social justice into the curriculum. They issued a final report late that year with 36 recommendations. Initially, those recommendations were treated by the administration as something that were going to be adopted wholesale. They had a list of all the recommendations on their website, and they had a status symbol next, or a status indicator next to each one of them, saying whether it was on time for completion or complete or in the early stages of completion. Here are some of those recommendations that this task force made. One of them was that all block directors and course directors, basically medical school faculty, will have changed their curricula by the fall of 2021 to adhere to the following core concepts. And already that any task force is telling faculty what core concepts they need to adhere to is an enormous red flag. But if you go down the list, a couple of them really stand out, especially number 4, or rather number 5, explain the difference between sex and gender and how specific organs and cells do not belong to specific genders. Another recommendation was that all students will be trained in core advocacy skills and be able to deploy advocacy skills in the following health realms by 2023. It includes a list of political causes that it recommends students be able to advocate for, including things like radical reform to the US criminal justice system and ending policies of exclusion and achieving compassionate immigration reform. Once again, a massive red flag for anyone who knows anything about academic freedom, yet something that was embraced by faculty and the administration of a top medical school in the United States. Similar story out of UC San Francisco. UC San Francisco adopted a created a task force on equity and anti-racism in research. So they already had their own task force on DEI, or their own DEI plan for the entire institution and for the medical school. This is specifically a plan for how to integrate these concepts into into medical research. And here's some of the things that came out of the task force. They said they're going to appoint an associate vice chancellor for research, inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-racism. So that's not just their associate vice chancellor for DEI, which is a position that already exists, but now a vice chancellor level position specifically created to integrate these ideas into the research that takes place at UC San Francisco. If any of you are involved in medicine or know something about medical research, NIH is, or rather UC San Francisco is one of the top earners of NIH grant money. It really is a powerhouse in medical research. So it's remarkable to see them essentially reorienting their entire research apparatus to integrate what in many ways seems like a political goal. Here's one quote from their task force's report. To truly rectify the entrenched structural harm from racism in research, we must start from its foundations in the way that we privilege knowledge, methods, and people. The overarching changes required to mitigate racism in research is a philosophical shift in the mindset of those in power and those who produce research. There is an intrinsically embodied perception of who and what knowledge and skills are privileged over others. If you want to read the full quote, it's there, but you get the idea. Moving on to other institutions, we can see examples again and again of how social justice, the goals of social justice have become seen by a lot of people within academia, and specifically, to use this one salient example, within medical research, social justice is seen as the final mission of these institutions. So for instance, in an article authored by a handful of deans at Mount Sinai's Icahn School of Medicine, they conclude with the statement, there is no priority in medical education that is more important than addressing and eliminating racism and bias. You'll notice that the publication date of this article is December 2020. It's a little remarkable to me that at the early stage of the pandemic, December 2020, somebody could pen the statement that there's no priority in medical education more important than racism and bias, as if nothing else was going on right then. Similarly, 2 years later, the leaders of the Association of American Medical Colleges released their own set of diversity, equity, and inclusion competencies. These are basically guidelines for teaching medical students. And what they say in their article announcing these competencies is, we believe this topic deserves just as much attention from learners and educators at every stage of their careers as the latest scientific breakthroughs. So how did we get here? I want to propose today that there are a lot of theories of how this massive transformation of the way people think about not just academia, but they think about a whole swath of issues. This transformation that has caused so many institutions to radically reorient themselves to prioritize social justice above all else. I want to propose that what's going on in faculty hiring is not the whole story, but it's a big part of the story. And if you don't really know what's going on in faculty hiring, if you don't know the way that people are being selected on the basis of these criteria, then you won't get the full picture. And a lot of the reporting that I have done, especially over the last year, has involved looking at precisely these kinds of issues. And again, I'll reiterate, it ultimately constitutes a large scandal. So I want to start by giving a little bit of background on the use of diversity statements in faculty hiring. So the policy of mandatory diversity statements, it works something like this. Many of you probably know this. For those of you who don't, now it's pretty common for faculty when they're applying for, or scholars and scientists, when they're applying for faculty positions, to submit a statement outlining their past and future contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, this policy began in the University of California system, probably around the 2010s. It might have been a little bit earlier than then, but the first instance of it being kind of regularly adopted into a university was around 2010. In 2013, the NSF-funded Advance program hosted a conference within the UC system on using and evaluating DEI contributions. And it's in at this conference that people from UC San Diego get up and say, look, this is the way you should be thinking about evaluating these statements. They say you should take a look at past contributions, future plans, and the way people understand diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the, this paradigm for evaluating these statements has really maintained for the last 10 years. If you look at the way that people evaluate this criteria in faculty hiring, again and again, they go back to these three things: past contributions, future plans, and understanding. At that conference, UCSD's vice chancellor announced that already starting in 2012, contributions to diversity would be a primary consideration for 30% of faculty jobs. So already in 2012, it's not only a requirement, it's not only something that people have to do as sort of a symbolic gesture, but it's actually it constitutes its own criterion that should be considered alongside things like university or like teaching and research. So where do things stand today? Today, the tool is widely used. In 2021, AEI released a survey that said they found 19% of faculty jobs required diversity statements. I think that number is probably, in some ways, a little outdated and a little low. The American Association of University Professors the next year released a survey saying that 45% of the tenure, or 45% of larger institutions that they surveyed said that diversity, equity, and inclusion was a part of their tenure criteria. So we've moved from diversity statements in hiring to it even becoming tenure criteria. Earlier this year, the Goldwater Institute released a survey of the faculty jobs at the three state universities in Arizona. They found that 81% of the jobs at ASU required diversity statements, 28% at University of Arizona, 73% at Northern Arizona University. So we can see that this is a really widespread practice. And it's worth noting as well that, often what you see is this criteria being applied even if there's not a formal diversity statement requirement. So for instance, if the job announcement doesn't require a specific diversity statement, but they say that their preferred qualifications include your ability to contribute to a diverse and inclusive environment, that'll almost definitely go on to the evaluation rubric, and that'll carry a certain amount of weight. And now that weight could be 5% of the overall score, but it could also be a lot more, as you'll see. And as many of you know, diversity statements come with a handful of controversies that have been widely discussed by this point. So a lot of people point to the issue of racial preferences. And this, I think, in part comes from a misunderstanding, but in part is a perceptive recognition of what's probably going on in certain instances. So, the official instructions given by universities on diversity statement is do not use diversity statements as a proxy for race. So people should not talk about their own identity when they're submitting these diversity statements. That's not something that ought to be considered. It's questionable whether it would be legal to consider that, especially in certain states like California. But nevertheless, there is the concern that, well, if you have this criteria, it's easier to use the tool as basically a cover for racial discrimination, which, as you'll see, certainly takes place in some instances. The more common concern, the one that we'll spend a lot of time talking about today, is viewpoint discrimination. There's a lively debate, which I know many of you probably are familiar with, especially given the fact that the U.S. law places, through its First Amendment protections, a heavy emphasis on academic freedom. The Supreme Court has said that academic freedom is a very special kind of freedom of speech. It does not tolerate laws that cast a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom. But when you're talking about something like a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, well, a lot of people say that that can cross over from simply discussing what you've done in the past to your commitment to a certain set of ideological and political views, which is why, across the political spectrum, a lot of people have argued that this constitutes a kind of political litmus test. And this is backed up by a survey done by FIRE, which found that 50% of faculty believe that diversity statements are a political litmus test. So I think that one thing that's interesting about this whole issue is that even a lot of university faculty who obviously skew far to the left of the general public and therefore might be more receptive to a policy that's perceived as a kind of progressive policy. No, even a lot of faculty say this seems like the wrong kind of criteria to apply, yet it's still widespread. I think the last area of controversy that kind of becomes a theme in my work is just the idea that this constitutes the wrong kind of priority in faculty hiring. It's something of it essentially downgrades academic excellence when you say that something so unrelated to a scholar's core work ought to be valued on the same level as that scholar's teaching and research. Yet we see that again and again. There's some really remarkable examples of that I've come up with. Here's that quote from the Supreme Court decision: does not tolerate laws that cast a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom. That's a good thing to keep, or that's a good quote to keep in mind as you read through exactly the reasons why professors are, or faculty job candidates are ultimately asked to, or are ultimately weeded out from from selection. So how are these statements used in practice? Often faculty search committees ask for consistent tools to evaluate these statements, and administrators want to provide guidelines. And as a result, a few universities have developed and widely disseminated rubrics for assessing DEI. So we have, for instance, the Berkeley rubric. It's found virtually everywhere. The most common place to find this rubric for assessing DEI, or rather the most common rubric for assessing DEI that you could possibly find out there is the Berkeley rubric. Here are just a few quotes from it. So you notice it lays out what scores you can get for different activities or different indicators on your diversity statement. And so in the category of knowledge about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, candidates can get a 1 to 2. That's the lowest score in this category. For the following, it says, seems not to be aware or understand the personal challenges that underrepresented individuals face in academia, or feel any personal responsibility for helping to create an equitable and inclusive environment. For example, may state that it's better not to have outreach or affinity groups aimed at particular individuals because it keeps them separate from everyone else, or it makes them feel less valued. Now, for those who aren't aware, affinity groups are basically groups that are separated out on the basis of race or gender. These are the Black student group, Black faculty group, Latinx student group, Latinx faculty group, widely criticized for being, basically a new form of segregation. And here you have a widely used rubric that says, well, if you express skepticism towards this tool for DEI, you will get a low score on your diversity statement. Let's see. Other parts of the Berkeley rubric, you can get a low score on your track record for advancing DEI. For instance, for using descriptions of activities that are brief, vague, nominal, or peripheral. In the category of plans for advancing DEI. This is the most remarkable quote. So candidates can get a low score for explicitly stating the intention to ignore the varying backgrounds of their students and treat everyone the same. So if you say you want to treat everyone the same, per the Berkeley rubric, you can get a low score on your diversity statement. That issue of viewpoint discrimination becomes clearer and clearer here, where, essentially saying you want to treat all of your students the same, that is shorthand for a view that you think it is better to be race neutral. You think it is better to be colorblind, and that's how you act in the classroom. That's a legitimate point of view, and that point of view is not tolerated by, this very, very commonly used rubric for assessing DEI. Another rubric worth mentioning is the Emory rubric. I won't show the whole thing. It's based in part on the Berkeley rubric, but was developed a good bit later. Note that it gives a 0 to certain things right out of the gate. For instance, if a faculty member or a faculty job applicant solely acknowledges that racism, classism, etc., are issues in the academy. So if it is not enough to believe that racism, classism, etc., are issues in the academy, you have to do something more than that. So if you're of the opinion that these things are not, in fact, pervasive throughout higher education, I don't know, that might get you less than a 0. It's not explained, but it's presumed that even just solely doing so is not enough. Going down to this category of valuing and understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think the most remarkable part of this rubric is at the very end, what can earn a candidate a high score. So first, we have demonstrates an understanding that diversity has many dimensions and that individuals have unique experiences given their intersectionality along these dimensions. So a nice little nod to Kimberly Crenshaw. And then vocalizes that anti-racism practices requires consistent and long-term growth, reflection, and engagement, and that they are prepared to put in this work. I mean, this was created around 2020. It's very implausible to me that this was created without the writer Ibram Kendi in mind, and this is a reflection of Ibram Kendi's understanding of anti-racism, that it's not merely a view of the world where you strive to not be racist, but you have to actually engage in certain consistent long-term practices. Otherwise, you might be inadvertently or very likely are inadvertently racist. This is an extremely ideologically charged way of evaluating what faculty job candidates have to say. So again, diversity statements are often heavily weighed in the selection process. And here, to just give a few examples from the research I've done, here is a score sheet. I acquired this from UT Austin, assessing candidates for a position in, I think it's cancer biology. Notice that DEI, teaching, and research each get their own 5-point column. Some candidates seem to be lower on the list because they have a low DEI statement score. This is not a job that was advertised as a DEI focused position. It's a hard science position. It just happened to have DEI as a criteria. When I looked and found the when I acquired these hiring documents, I was kind of surprised that even though it read like pretty much any of the other job descriptions out there, it clearly was a heavy component in the faculty hiring process. Let's see. Here's another example. This is the rubric used at Utah State University. Now, this is for a job that was specifically billed as a DEI-focused job, in mathematical biology. Notice, and it might be kind of hard to tell because of the way I've had to format it, but notice that DEI ultimately constitutes 15 points. Teaching efficacy constitutes 20 points. Research potential constitutes 15 points. So we really have an instance where mathematical biologists are being evaluated pretty much roughly equally for their research potential, teaching, and contributions to DEI. And then another aspect of this that's worth pointing out is the rise of something called cluster hiring. Now, cluster hiring, there are a few really noteworthy examples that go nicely with the rubrics that I've shown you today. One example comes from Emory University. So in 2019, Emory University's Dean of Arts and Sciences wrote this article titled, "The Case for Cluster Hiring to Diversify Your Faculty." Basically, implicitly acknowledging that you cannot simply hire on the basis of race. So in order to increase the diversity of your faculty, you need to find another way to make it so that your pool of applicants and your shortlist and your list of finalists are more diverse, at least if that's a priority. And clearly for Emory, that was a priority. So Freeman describes two ways to undergo cluster hiring. The first, and I'm not going to talk as much about this, but it's very, very much noteworthy, is hiring multiple faculty at once who all focus on the same subdiscipline that would be more likely to attract, or at least in their minds, more likely to attract a minority candidate. So you often see cluster hires in Black studies, Latinx studies, or sometimes more overtly politicized topics. University of Illinois had a cluster hire in the racialized body, which used, basically the language of Ta-Nehisi Coates to describe what they were looking for in hiring their faculty. You have a couple of universities in the UC system running cluster hires and things like designing just futures, where the language of social justice and progressive politics basically woven throughout the job announcement. But the more noteworthy kind of cluster hiring for my purposes today that Freeman points out is cluster hiring that's specifically focused on the use of diversity statements as a heavily weighted criterion. So here's what Freeman said in the article. She says, for this kind of cluster hiring, her approach is simply diversity statement, then dossier. The way that she first was able to increase the diversity of her shortlist in a STEM-focused discipline, which it's notable that STEM disciplines, there's only so far you can go with sub-disciplines that might be more attractive to or ostensibly more attractive to certain racial groups. In the hard sciences, this tool has to be used more. And what she said was basically what we did is we made the first round cut based on diversity statement. And then after doing that, we looked at the dossier. We have a similar example coming out of Berkeley. Many of you might know about this. Berkeley initiated in 2017 the Life Sciences Hiring Initiative. They, for this cluster hire in the life sciences, the university received around 800 applicants. They cut the pool from 800 to 214 on the basis of diversity statements alone. And now it's interesting to take a look at their demographic outcomes here. And this goes to a theme that I think is important to bring up, that there are really two aspects to this whole approach to hiring that are somewhat concerning. On one hand, you have issues of free expression, you have issues of academic freedom. On the other hand, it seems you also have issues of, maybe attempts to get around non-discrimination law and, the provisions of the Civil Rights Act. Here, if you look, the applicant pool, changes pretty dramatically from initial pool to shortlist, especially if you take a look at the white candidates. You have 53% that goes down to 13%. Hispanic candidates, 13% goes up to 59%, almost a complete reversal. That's pretty remarkable on one hand, but it's also interesting to note that the diversity statements didn't actually make that much of a difference. When you see the jump from applicant pool to long list, white candidates go from 53% to 48%. Hispanic candidates go from 13% to 22%. Moderate shifts across the board, and you see the really dramatic shift going from long list to short list, which interestingly was not the instance where they used anonymized diversity statements, but in fact, the report doesn't really describe what they do between the applicant pool or between the long list and the short list to so dramatically change the makeup of the applicant pool, which to me suggests that maybe something else was going on, but you can't know. But it's definitely stands out. So a few related issues that, again, are very much worth bringing up. And that one is that racial preferences in hiring, despite being legally suspicious, often take, are often a routine part of faculty hiring process. So for instance, here we have a rubric that I acquired from UT San Antonio, which just outlines what candidates get judged on. Notice at the very end, there's a category for female or URM candidate. Now, when I emailed the NAS board member and University of San Diego law professor Gail Harriet about this, her response was simply, "Yep, that's illegal." And yeah, this in my experience is not necessarily a very uncommon tool or way of assessing faculty, or just blatant racial preferences, even though it's not necessarily legal. At the same time, we have demographic pool checks. Now, this is just one more tool that's used in the hiring process that encourage faculty search committees to reassess what kind of criteria they use, and probably in the long run encourages them to more heavily rely on these diversity statements and use these ultimately ideologically charged rubrics. So a lot of universities have the policy that throughout the process, when they have an initial pool of applicants, when they have a short list of applicants, when they have a slate of finalists, the dean, someone from the dean's office or a dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion checks in with them and makes sure that it passes a certain threshold of minority candidates. So here's an email I acquired from UT Austin where the diversity search advocate for a design faculty search is emailing her dean saying, "I want to make sure that the demographics of our pool pass muster. I'm attaching them here." The dean then responds as a general metric, 21% is enough to move forward. The larger question, of course, is how many in that 21% are likely to advance to the next level of the search. In other words, if 20 of the 23 URM applicants are dropped in the early cut, then things don't look so good anymore. Okay, so I formally titled the talk "Investigating Faculty Hiring," and I want to give you, to kind of conclude what I have to say, a few case studies in what I've done over the last year using public records requests, using publicly available documents, and using tips from faculty members who tell me the kinds of documents that I should be looking at. And so here are a few case studies, because again, with all of the information that I've given you, we have policies that are sort of publicly known and publicly available, but it's still, for a lot of people, an open question: how do people actually get evaluated in these searches? Are they used in the way that some advocates of diversity statements and diversity criteria say they should be used, as a sort of viewpoint neutral, race neutral way of assessing whether a faculty member is being welcoming to all students, or are they used for something, as critics say, as something of a political litmus test? And so a few case studies, I think, can really clarify things. So let's see. In 2020, the first would be Texas Tech University. I wrote about this in the early this year and winter of this year. In 2020, Texas Tech's Department of Biological Sciences adopted a DEI resolution mandating the heavy use of diversity statements. The language is up there on the slide. It says they will require the Department of Biological Sciences faculty search committees to, among other things, provide a report to, or rather, require and strongly weight a diversity statement from all candidates and provide an evaluation rubric, and then going down, provide a report to the Department of Biological Sciences faculty that include diversity metrics and a report on the evaluation of the required diversity statements. Now, as somebody who does these kinds of investigations, it was nice to run across that statement, which was evidence that these reports actually existed. These reports on the way that search committees evaluated diversity statements. I acquired them, And this really gave us the first inside look into what people are how people are evaluated when these diversity statements are required and heavily weighed. And so here are some examples. One candidate, when describing one candidate's weaknesses in the area of DEI, they said, mentioned that DEI is not an issue because he respects his students and treats them equally. This indicates a lack of understanding of equity and inclusion issues. Another candidate, poor understanding of the difference between equity and equality, even on redirect, which suggests a rather superficial understanding of DEI more generally. Another candidate was praised for, among other things, land acknowledgement in talk. Finally, another candidate was flagged. This is not necessarily an issue of viewpoint discrimination, but it shows how some of these issues feed into each other. A lot of people have made, I think, pretty salient critiques of the concept of microaggressions as a way of thinking about interactions with people that encourage you to read into what could be totally normal interactions and assume either nefarious intent or harm just based on things that might be sort of just everyday human exchanges. So here we have a red flag, not during DEI meeting, but observed multiple examples of microaggressions towards women faculty. Their examples are assuming one junior faculty member was a graduate student. Okay, that could be evidence that this person is boorish, or it could be evidence that this person somebody looked young. And minimizing the difficulties of women in the US by comparing to worse situations elsewhere, which I think is an interesting thing to put down as a red flag, given that objectively speaking, women in fact do have worse situations elsewhere. But we don't know exactly how this went. It doesn't seem like the greatest thing to put down in the evaluation of a job candidate. As a result of this report, after I published this article, almost immediately afterwards, this is a positive theme to bring out in this article or in this talk, which is that when people hear about this kind of policy, they have a very hard time defending it. And when people, who are already inclined to be skeptical, hear about these kinds of policies, they are very quick to act. So I published the article on February 7th. By the end of that day, Governor Abbott told state agencies within Texas to stop considering diversity statements in hiring. In his memo, he said that the activity was illegal. Likewise, that same day, Texas Tech released a statement saying that they will no longer use diversity statements in their faculty hiring and basically say, oh, this was just a one-off. It was just the Department of Biological Sciences, and we've corrected the issue. Whether or not you believe that is another question, but at the very least, the response was swift and positive. Another example would be the National Institutes of Health FIRST program. That's Faculty Institutional Recruitment for Sustainable Transformation. Now, this is I talked earlier about cluster hiring. Cluster hiring has now become a well-funded tool that is pushed by the NIH around the country. NIH FIRST funds to the tune of $250 million, cohort hiring programs where they give large grants of $10, $15 million to universities who then go and use this method to hire between 6 and 10 faculty in the biomedical sciences. It's inspired by other cluster hiring programs, including Emory University's. Carla Freeman came to a NIH webinar on cohort hiring to discuss. This was clearly connected to the NIH FIRST cluster hiring program. And a requirement that's baked into these grants is that the faculty hired through the program must demonstrate a commitment to what they call inclusive excellence, and they have to show that commitment through the use of a diversity statement. So in my investigating, I went to the public universities that had been given a grant by the NIH through this program and asked them for their rubrics for assessing diversity statements. I got a response from the University of South Carolina, Here's a picture of their rubric. Notice in the category of plans for advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, you can get a low score for explicitly stating the intention to ignore the varying backgrounds of their students and treat everyone the same. So University of South Carolina, funded by the NIH, is using the Berkeley rubric as a way to screen out faculty job applicants in the biomedical sciences. Going to University of New Mexico, similarly, again, in the category of plans for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusive excellence, same thing. Explicitly states the intention to ignore the varying background of their students and treat everyone the same. We have two known instances where, actually, I now know that there are more, but these are the two that I wrote about in the spring of this year. Two instances where, through the NIH's large grant program, faculty, universities are basically instituting this tool for evaluating faculty that is almost blatantly, obviously viewpoint discriminatory. It's also worth pointing out that earlier I talked about how the UC system, they held this conference on how to evaluate faculty diversity statements, and they held the conference on the basis, or they held the conference it was funded by the National Science Foundation's Advance program. And that program has been integral in kind of disseminating university DEI policies around the country. If your university has really intense DEI policies, it's most likely connected to their NSF Advance program. It's very much involved. The same thing is happening with NIH First. NIH First, because there's a lot of money behind it, has encouraged universities, even universities that were not ultimately funded, to adopt this method of faculty hiring. So we see at Ohio State, they did not receive an NIH First grant. The grant program is closed, yet they continued to, they decided to go ahead and do it anyway. Same with University of Cincinnati. They have their own First cluster hiring program. They call it First, but they did not receive NIH money. They decided to just go ahead and do it themselves. Same with UMass Chan School of Medicine. I acquired their rubric for evaluating diversity statements. And again, if you see on the bottom, it says adapted from UC Berkeley's rubric for assessing candidate contributions to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Another example that I wrote about in the fall was University of Washington. Now, some background on this. I received a tip earlier this year that race was being used inappropriately in a faculty job search in psychology. So I pretty much immediately made a public records request for emails and other hiring documents surrounding this hire. I was told soon after that UW initiated its own Office of Civil Rights investigation, proceedings basically, where they looked into exactly what was going on. And even though I have not yet received the documents that I requested in March of this year, I'm going to receive them presumably on December 14th, the university ended up creating its own report on this hiring issue, which I acquired via a leak, which gives us a very interesting inside look into what's happened, again, how these policies play out in practice. So from the report, they said, among the 3 above threshold candidates in this search for a professor of psychology, the hiring committee unanimously decided an order of offers. The first offer was to a white candidate, second to an Asian candidate, third to a Black candidate. Afterwards, emails indicate that one member of the diversity advisory committee, who was also a member of the faculty search committee, essentially expressed the being unsettled about the offer, saying specifically that the order of candidates is optically speaking a bad look because the number 1 offer goes to a white candidate. They then say the area visibly seems like it could use more diversity in faculty constitution. They then proceed to have a number of meetings where the order of candidates changes from white, Asian, Black to the first offer goes to the Black candidate, second goes to the Asian candidate, third goes to the white candidate. And the report specifically notes that at no point do the search committee members who were the holdouts for the original ordering of candidates, at no point do they say, yes, we agree that on the merits, this is how the ranking should be changed. They instead list a number of the UW report lists a number of reasons why the faculty candidates or the faculty search committee members end up changing their mind so as not to create a bloodbath at a faculty meeting, so that they're not accused of not prioritizing DEI, and other such things very much unrelated to whether or not the candidate was the candidate who ended up getting the offer was actually the best candidate for the job. What's also noteworthy for our purposes today is that the report also includes an excerpt from an email indicating the way that DEI statements were used, at least by UW faculty members. They say, the report notes that emails indicate that this faculty member who is on the search committee believes that DEI statements should be used to the advantage of certain targeted racial groups. Quote, you get a lot of people focusing statements on URM mentoring as their main activity, and that tends to advantage white women rather than the intended target group. And I think it's worth noting when you see this kind of thing that you often get with these policies, on one hand, the stated intention, on the other hand, basically you get a lot of wiggle room to use the policy in a way that's not sanctioned by the university. And because the policy is at a certain point things tend to remain confidential, it's hard to actually tell what goes on unless you have, for instance, a FOIA request that leads to a university investigation, which is not necessarily all that common. Okay, finally, last example is for my most recent reporting on the Ohio State University. So I think this one's a good one to end on because it gives a good example of what a large investment in DEI can ultimately look like. So Ohio State University has 189 DEI officers. They, in 2021, initiated a massive faculty hiring initiative focused on DEI called the RAISE Initiative. Their Faculty of Arts and Sciences were required as a standard policy to submit diversity faculty recruitment reports whenever they conducted a faculty job search. And it's these reports that I acquired through a public records request. After about 9 months of waiting, OSU finally turned over the reports, which include, I think, a lot of I would say they are very telling because OSU has placed such an emphasis on DEI in both in the number of diversity officers it's hired and in its diversity hiring initiative, the RAISE initiative. So while some departments certainly didn't play along, they had these reports that were supposed to talk about how their candidates contributed to DEI, how they assessed DEI, what diversity needs they had within the departments. There were a few reports that actually said things like, but we're just going to focus when evaluating these diversity statements on what people have done to create a more inclusive environment. And at the same time, some departments even noted, or I think 2 or 3 out of the roughly 150 searches, out of those searches, 2 or 3 mentioned even the dearth of conservative professors on campus when talking about their department's diversity needs. At the same time, a lot of the search committees seem to eagerly comply. And here are just a few examples. So from a search in physics, we have one search committee answering the question, how were diversity statements evaluated? They say, informed by the inclusive hiring training, the DEI statement was given equal weight to research and teaching statements. For molecular genetics, in answering the same question, the search committee notes that the diversity statement was used as a major criterion, along with the teaching statement and other criteria at every stage of the review process. They also list their rubric. Once again, we have an adapted version of the Berkeley rubric. For a search in freshwater biology, they note that each diversity statement was screened twice. In the second assessment of the 10 finalist applicants, the rubric weighted research at 66% and impact on diversity at 34%. They note that at both points, they use the Emory rubric. At the same time, there are numerous instances where search committees record how they reward identity politics and boutique identity categories. So one search notes the report requires them to describe how each of the finalist candidates would amplify the value of diversity, inclusion, and innovation. The first ranked candidate, they note at the end, Dr. Redacted, also identifies as a first-generation fat queer scholar of color. That's quite a surprising thing to see in a faculty hiring document. Another, as a white male, this candidate does not outwardly present as a diversity candidate. However, we want to call to attention that their research, which is focused on design for diversity, equity, and inclusion, as exhibited by their most recent 2021 publication, Critical Race Theory, Design, Education, and Change. Another, they note that this candidate's awareness of some of the challenges facing underrepresented groups in higher education is partially informed through his marriage to an immigrant in Texas in the age of Trump. And ultimately, we also get indications of racial preferences and, in some instances, blatant admissions of racial preferences. So for one search in, I believe that's medical anthropology, they note that they received 67 applicants. One person identified as Native American, 2 as Black or African American, one of whom identified as Black and Latinx. The finalists include that one Native American, those 2 Black candidates, and 1 Hispanic candidate. Defying, as many of you will note, the odds given that they have 67 applicants. Another search committee simply states that they were keenly aware of the need to prioritize the hiring of a visible minority, thus selecting a pool of 12 candidates for interviews reflecting that priority. They later say, in our deliberations to select finalists, the importance of bringing Black scholars to campus was deemed to be essential. We thus chose 3 Black candidates. We decided as a committee that diversity was just as important as perceived merit as we made our selection. So, to conclude, I think that as someone from the outside, although I work in the higher education space, I'm not a professor, I've never been a professor, I'm more and more aware of the way in which universities can often constitute an echo chamber. You can have medical schools that go off the rails and institute as medical school policy things that a lot of ordinary people would think are just absolutely crazy. You can have professors at major universities praise Hamas days after Hamas terrorists attack Israeli citizens. You can have a wide variety of instances like this that indicate a cultural problem. And I think that cultural problem makes a lot more sense in light of the fact that we are prioritizing in our selection of faculty in many instances, their adherence to ultimately political and ideological presuppositions. And I think that that's very concerning. And my goal as somebody who investigates and reports is to shine a light on that and to show what's actually going on. I think that I've done that to a certain extent, but I'm going to keep doing that because I think that there's a lot more here that I would like to learn about exactly the how these things work. And so with that, I want to open up to discussion, and I'll also, plug my contact info. If you know of instances where these kinds of things have happened, this is exactly what I want to look into. So you can certainly reach out to me. I'd be very interested to hear of more opportunities to